So just before I start, we had a bit of an adventure yesterday. We, meaning Bully, Bruce, and the dean from the cathedral in Pietermaritzburg, amongst others, but we were together in a car. We left here at 3:30 in the morning, and we drove to Flagstaff, which is in the Transkei. Some of you have driven through it, probably never stopped there on the way to Port St. John's or places like that. We went there because, as we announced last week, Bishop Tsetsi was being installed as the new bishop of the Diocese of Umbumbulu. And it was a wonderful occasion, a wonderful service, a relaxed 4 hours of church, wonderful liturgy. We sang 25 hymns. Yes, I counted. And all the verses of all the hymns. And most of them were in isiXhosa or Sotho, so I didn't know what was going on, but I knew the tunes. But it was a wonderful celebration, just to know that the Anglican Church is alive and flourishing in the rural sides, settlements in and around the Eastern Cape. And just to support Tsetsi, a lot of bishops there and other people, and it was good. So we got back last night at 7:30, and it was a bit of a daze, but I've woken up fresh. Still fighting off a little bit of a cold, so I may get the coughs. Wisdom. Christian wisdom. I want to just throw some thoughts at you. We could have a whole series on this for 3 years and only scratch the surface. In our reading today, it articulated 3 wisdom stances. So there's the reading, the Jews demand signs, the Greeks look for wisdom, and we preached Christ crucified, which is a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. But to us, whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness stronger than human strength. The Greeks had a wisdom stance that needed, in a sense, a philosophical cognitive wisdom of logic, etc. And we see it in the likes of the greats of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. And we still benefit from that wisdom. And it was an important part of the wisdom heritage of our culture and our society today. The Jewish stance was very different. They spoke about God acting in signs. And in the Old Testament, God revealed God's self through what God did in an active way, be it in a miracle, be it in dealing with an enemy or a problem, etc. And so the book of John, the Gospel of John, doesn't talk about miracles of Jesus, it talks about the signs of Jesus. And so you have this understanding of a sign. It's much more tangible, down to earth than the Greek approach. Christian wisdom is a radically third alternative. In many ways, it's a combination of both, but in such a way that it's foolishness to both. So let me help you unpack a little bit of that today. Paul says it's Christ crucified, both the sign of God's power and authority and the wisdom of God. What does it mean for us? Well, if we reach back into the Old Testament, if we think about wisdom, we normally turn to that passage. Sorry, I've gone the wrong thing here. Go back. It's because of Jesus Christ, Paul ends that passage today. The wisdom of God is about righteousness, holiness, and redemption. In fact, if you look at wisdom tradition over the centuries and in different cultures, you'll find those 3 ideas, righteousness, holiness, and redemption, are core themes of the wisdom quest that we find in humanity. But if we look for our roots, we find it in Proverbs chapter 3. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. You see, Christian wisdom starts with not trusting our own cognitive capacities. Using them, but not trusting them. But that doesn't mean it's a simplistic kind of faith or trust. No, it's not an uninformed trust. It's a learned, experienced, and developing trust. It's a lived faithfulness, as the longer part of this passage reminds us, living with reverent fear of the mightiness of God and the reality of pervasive evil. So just some random thoughts about Christian wisdom. As I've just said, it's a heart trust, not a mind understanding. It's not about knowing more. Christian wisdom is not about knowing more. That's knowledge. And you can have a lot of knowledge but not be wise. It's about knowing with more of you. It's about knowing deeper and within your whole being. A Christian wisdom is a way of being and a way of living that in which we are fully present to the reality of Christ in us, permeating our whole being of living and loving. So we can say we mustn't ask what is wisdom. We must rather ask as Christians, who is wisdom? Remember, Paul said wisdom is Christ crucified. You see, Christian wisdom is a deeply personal. It's a personal journey. It's transformational, relational, and communal. If you read any of the Christian sages of the past and try to tune into their wisdom, the Christian mystics, etc., you will discover this. It's all about intimacy. It's all about that unique relationship that they develop with God. And often it is unique to them and their journey, but has patterns that we can tap into. Because it's Jesus, the Word of God, made flesh. It's the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, in that divine cosmic dance of love, whatever that is and however we understand that. Think about Jesus, just a couple of his sayings, paraphrased. To find your life, you must first lose it. To achieve eternal treasures, you must abandon all your earthly ones. The last will be first, and the first will be last. The meek and the poor in spirit, not the powerful, will inherit the earth. Giving is the way to receive. Yielding is the way to conquer. Dying is the way to truly live. Topsy-turvy, upside down, profound wisdom that Jesus gives us. James records it like this: the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Friends, Christian wisdom is in a sense meant to flow into us through the totality of our experiential existence and then flow out of us into the world. If it doesn't flow like that, it's not Christian wisdom. It might be a lot of knowledge or hot air, but it's a living wisdom that we talk about. So, before you feeling, Kevin, you're losing me now, let me try and get down to earth and practical. How do we live it out? Just two ideas, and really we're only going to unpack one this morning. The first idea, if you want to discover wisdom, comes from Jesus' start of the Sermon on the Mount. His wisdom statements, the Beatitudes. To change our attitudes into a beatitude is the starting point of Christian wisdom. And secondly, which I will unpack a bit more today, to discover the power and the freedom of the concept of indifference. But before I do that, go back to the cross. Those of you who weren't here last week, Bully was preaching and invited us to put up a white flag of surrender and to write on it something we wanted to surrender to God, and then put it in the cross. And look how many of you did. It looks wonderful. And I went and I had a look at some of those. And I'll put some of those ideas up shortly. But around this idea of surrender, that's the starting point to the wisdom journey. And it's contained for us in Romans 12, 1-2, which we echo in the prayer we say together at the end of every communion, when we offer ourselves to be living sacrifices. Think about the totality of the wisdom journey contained in these two verses as I read them. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. The wisdom quest is the totality of who we are in transformation of heart and mind and body and soul. So what are some of the things you wrote up that you wanted to submit again, to surrender again? There are some of them. Some of them were written on 4 or 5 or 6 of those sheets. A common awareness within oneself as to what we need to do. So back to how do we live this out? That's the start, an attitude of surrender. We live it out in the first way, the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes themselves reveal a countercultural, upside-down, revolutionary dynamic of God's life-transforming wisdom. We're not going to look at them today because we've chosen to use them as our Lenten theme this year. So during Lent, we'll be getting into them. And the title we've given is Game Changers, 8 Attitudes That Change Your Altitude. So we kind of say pause on understanding those for a couple of weeks before we journey together. What I do want to look at today is the idea of indifference. And when a lot of Christians hear the word indifference, or anyone, they say, indifference? No, it's my life we're talking about. I can't be indifferent about my life. There's important things. I would say that's not Christian indifference. So if you feel that, and it's right and true to feel that, then listen carefully. It starts with maybe this Peter Fryer expresses. I beg of you, my Lord, to remove anything that separates from me and you from me. It's the idea of seeking to be intimacy with God, that nothing is a barrier. That's what we're talking about in this. Christian indifference is freedom. Really? Yes, it is. It's the freedom to approach any decision-making we have in a fresh way. It's the ability to be detached from your initial bias or preference, a willingness and an ability to step back to weigh balance in a balanced way the alternatives so that you are open to God's working in your life. And the scale says it all. When seeking Christian wisdom in a decision-making process, you need the scale to balance. In other words, if you've only got 2 options, or if it's a 3D scale with a lot of options, they all need to be equally an option, not biased to one side before you pray. So you need to journey to the place when you are able to say, I now have indifference. Here's a story to help illustrate that. The woodcutter's wisdom. Once there was an old man who lived in a tiny village. Although poor, he was envied by all, for he owned a beautiful white horse. Even the king coveted this horse, his treasure. A horse like this had never been seen before. It was such splendor, majesty, and strength. People offered fabulous prices for the steed, but the old man always refused. This horse is not a horse to me, it is a person. How could you sell a person? He's a friend, not a possession. How can you sell a friend? The man was poor and the temptation was great, but he never sold the horse. One morning he found the horse was not in the stable. All the village came to see him. You old fool, they scoffed. We told you someone would steal your horse. We warned you would be robbed. Now you are so poor. How could you ever hope to have protected an animal like that? It would be better if you just sold them. You could have had all that money to live off. No amount would have been too high to pay for that. Now it's gone and you're cursed with misfortune. The old man responded, Don't speak too quickly. Only say that the horse is not in the stable. That's all we know. The rest is judgment. If I've been cursed or not, how can you know? How can you judge? The people contested, don't make us out to be fools. We may not be philosophers, but great philosophy is not needed here. Simple fact, your horse is gone and that's a curse. Old man spoke again. I know that the stable is empty and the horse is gone. The rest I don't know. Whether it's a blessing or a curse, I can't say. All we can see is a fragment. Who can say what will come next? The people laughed and they went off thinking the old man is crazy. They'd always thought he was a fool, because if he wasn't, he would have sold the horse and lived off the money. Instead, he's still a simple, poor woodcutter, cutting firewood, dragging it out of the forest, and selling it. He lived hand to mouth, misery of poverty. Now he had proved he was indeed a fool. After 15 days, the horse returned. Hadn't been stolen. It had run away into the forest. Not only did the horse return, it brought 12 wild horses with it. Once again, the village people gathered around the woodcutter and spoke. "Old man, you were right." "We were wrong. We thought it was a curse, but it was a blessing. Please forgive us." The man responded, "Once again, you go too far. Only say the horse is back. State only that 12 horses returned with him. Don't judge. How do you know if this is a blessing or not? You only see a fragment. Unless you know the whole story, how can you judge? You read one page and you judge a book. You hear one word of a phrase and you understand the whole phrase. No. Life is vast, yet all of life can't be judged on one word or one page. All you have is a fragment. Don't say it's a blessing. No one knows. I'm content with what I know, and I'm not perturbed with what I don't." "Maybe the old man is right," they said one to another. So they said little. But deep down inside, they knew he was wrong. They thought it was a blessing. 12 wild horses returned with one horse. With a bit of work, the animals could be broken in, trained, and sold for a lot of money. Now, this old man had a young son, an only son. And the young son began to break in the horses. But after a few days, he fell from one of the horses and broke both his legs. Once again, the villagers gathered around the old man and cast their judgments. "You were right," they said. "You proved you were right. The 12 horses were not a blessing. They were a curse. Your son has broken, your only son, both his legs, and now in your old age you've got no one to help you. Now you are poorer than ever." The old man spoke again. "You people are obsessed with judging. Don't go so far. Only say, 'My son has broken both legs.' Who knows if it's a blessing or a curse? No one knows. We only have a fragment. Life comes in fragments." And so it happened that a few weeks later, that country was engaged in a war with a neighboring country. All the young men of the village were conscripted and required to go and fight in the army. Only this son of the old man was excluded because he was injured. Once again, the people gathered around the old man, crying and screaming because their sons had been taken. And there was little hope that they would return because the enemy was strong and the war would be a losing struggle. They would never see their sons again. "You were right, old man," they wept. "God knows you were right. This proves that your son's accident was a blessing. His legs may be broken, but at least he's with you. Our sons are gone forever." The old man spoke again. "Impossible to talk with you. You always draw conclusions. No one knows. Only say this. Your sons had to go to war and mine did not. No one knows if it's a blessing or a curse. No one is wise enough to know. Only God knows." All stories have their limitations when we push them too far, but enjoy that one and the perspective it offers us on indifference. We're never told if the old man had preferences, and I'm sure he did. I'm sure he felt deeply when the horse was no longer in the stable, or the care and compassion when the son had broken both legs. But he had learnt the gift of indifference, and not to read in too much, and not to judge, but rather to be slow. He was able to take what came his way, not in a negative, fatalistic kind of way, or with an optimistic, presumptuous, God is always blessing me kind of way. No, he chose a way of living and loving that responded to the waves of change that came upon him, maximizing the present and living as fully as he knew in the now. And we have Jesus' example, which I end with. Look at this passage as recorded. Jesus felt deeply what he was about to face. Then he said to them, Jesus did, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little further, he fell with his face to the ground and he prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour? He asked Peter. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." There's a change in his prayer. In the first one, he is feeling bias towards not having to go through what he knew was coming. But in the last line, if you look at it, "If it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." He's come to a point of indifference. He hasn't not expressed his preferences. Having expressed them, he sought to be intimate with God's will. He's acknowledged almost in berating the disciples, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. That was his own sentiment. I'm willing, but I'm weak in that process. He wrestled, but his tone changes when he submits and when he chooses to have the freedom of indifference. And it was that freedom that allowed him to get up from there to face, with freedom and power, all that was about to face him in the next few hours. All that torture, all that pain, all that dying on the cross, because of that indifference that he'd been empowered with at this moment. So there's one of a number of examples from the Bible, but one in Jesus himself, in Jesus crucified. So as we wrap up, if any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God, because he will give you generously, ungrudgingly. What you do with the wisdom, how you interpret it, well, that's the real question. Remember what Jesus said. The beginning of wisdom is to lose yourself in order that you might find yourself. And in finding your new self in Christ, you will begin to understand the fullness of Christian wisdom. So Christian wisdom, like in the Beatitudes, is about placing ourselves through the attitude of surrender into a place of being, where the love of God transforming in us, Christ in us, can flow out into the world so that we are caught up in the flow of God's wisdom as it is expressed in life, so that his name may be glorified. Hopefully that's made some sense to some of you. Amen.